We are really, really privileged to have Michael here. Michael and his fiancée, Emily. Michael is the world's leading expert at fluoridation. This is the grand finale tonight in Wellington. So we've done 7 talks and they've been really, really well attended. Because of our demand, we have live streamed tonight into 7 places around the country, 6 of them down south and 1 up at Gisborne. Without further ado, here's Michael, and I'm sure you will find this presentation really, really interesting and important.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. I want to just start by thanking Mary Byrne. She has done phenomenal work for years, working to raise awareness. I want to thank Sean O'Brien, her partner, who is amazing and has been a joy to travel New Zealand with. Thank you, Sean, for doing so much for this. And I'm really happy that my fiancée Emily was able to make the trip with me as well, which has been a real joy. So, I want to talk with you today. I want to bring you with me on this journey that I had suing the US government over water fluoridation. With litigation, at least in the United States, you have the opportunity to do depositions. And in depositions, you get to ask people questions under oath. So it's not a monologue anymore. It's a dialogue. In this case, I was able to cross-examine many federal government officials and federal scientists. And they say the crucible of cross-examination helps to ferret out the truth. So in this case, we didn't have to just rely on government press releases. So now, with that said, let's talk about this case. I think you will find that what we learned is very relevant to you here in Wellington and other areas of New Zealand that fluoridate their water. And by the way, before we begin, New Zealand actually adds more fluoride to its water than we do in the United States, believe it or not. New Zealand still generally adds, to my knowledge, about 0.8 parts per million to its water, whereas in the United States, we've brought that down to 0.7. And in some areas of Canada, they now do it about 0.6. So just keep that in mind as we talk today. Okay, so let's start with chapter 1. So in 2016, we filed what's called a citizen petition. And we filed this citizen petition with the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. The EPA is the federal agency at the US government that is responsible for protecting us, the public, from the harmful effects of environmental chemicals. Okay? And we filed this petition under a law called the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. And TSCA gives the EPA the authority to ban the particular use of a chemical that poses an unreasonable risk to human health, including to susceptible subsets of the population. So why did we bring this case under the Toxic Substances Control Act? Well, the US Congress passed this law in part to counter bureaucratic lethargy. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a feeling that you might have encountered some bureaucratic lethargy from your Ministry of Health. Congress in the United States, in one of its rare moments of clarity, recognized that there are times when the EPA and other government agencies may be overlooking an important risk to human health. And given that, they wanted to have a mechanism, this citizen petition mechanism, that would allow citizens to challenge and push back on EPA when EPA is overlooking an important risk. And how did it do that? What it did is it said, if you go to court and challenge the EPA under this act, the court cannot simply rubber stamp what the EPA said. The court has to look at the evidence independently. And that was very attractive to us because we had been trying for years to get the EPA to do something about the new science on fluoride and the health risks from fluoridation. And EPA had denied us, ignored us, and ignored us some more. And that's why we brought suit. So 2016, we delivered over 300 studies to the EPA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. And in our petition, we contended that adding fluoride to drinking water poses an unreasonable risk to the brain in the form of neurotoxicity. Okay, so we only focus, and I want you to keep this in mind, we only focus on one health effect or one health domain, the effects on the brain. But there are other important concerns with how fluoride can affect our health over chronic long-term consumption, including bone fragility, like increasing the risk of bone fracture, okay, thyroid disease, and other concerns. But in our case, we focus on the brain. So that was the focus, okay? So we filed the petition, and as expected, the EPA denied it. I expected that. And so we filed suit in federal court in 2017. Now, when we filed suit, the EPA moved to dismiss the case, okay? And we had a lengthy argument about it. The court denied their motion, so we were able to get into the case. But then something important happened. The EPA asked the court to deny us any right to discovery, okay? Now, I'm an attorney. I sue large corporations, okay, over the effects of toxic chemicals, and I love discovery, okay? Love it. Why do I love it? Because it allows you to get in there. It says, give me your documents on this, give me your communications on that, and I want to depose your vice president. I want to depose, various people in your organization. You learn a lot of good stuff that you can't learn in ordinary life, okay? Those government press releases, nah, you're not learning much from those, okay? So the EPA goes to the court and says, deny all discovery in the case. I'm very happy to say the court denied that motion, and we got into discovery. I was absolutely thrilled about that. We were able to litigate this case like we were litigating against Monsanto, but it was the US government instead, which is very rare. So let's look at some of what we asked and learned in discovery, okay? So one of the questions I obviously wanted to ask people about was, does fluoride adversely affect the brain? And here, in this first clip, and this is from a deposition, this is the director of the Division of Oral Health at the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Has anyone heard of the CDC? They're a bit like your Ministry of Health. Now, the CDC, as you probably well know, is a very enthusiastic and aggressive promoter of water fluoridation, okay? So in this clip, I asked the director of CDC's Division of Oral Health about some new animal data that has come to light. Animal studies where scientists have exposed laboratory animals to fluoride and then looked at the brain and found a number of concerning and disturbing changes in the brain. And I wanted to get CDC's position on whether these findings are valid. Okay, so let's look at what he says. So the NRC found that lipids and phospholipids and protein content have been shown to be reduced in the brains of laboratory animals subsequent to fluoride exposure. Correct?
That's what they're saying here, yes.
And the CDC agrees with that finding.
Yes, as a summary of the hazard.
You see the next section on this page is titled Anatomical Changes in the Brain.
Yes.
And it begins, studies of rats exposed to sodium fluoride or aluminum fluoride have reported distortion in cells in the outer and inner layers of the neocortex. Neuronal deformations were also found in the hippocampus and to a smaller extent in the amygdala and the cerebellum. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with that finding as a summary of the hazard.
As it relates to rat studies, yes.
Okay. And you see the next highlighted portion in that paragraph?
I do.
It reads, the substantial enhancement of reactive microglia, the presence of stained intracellular neurofilaments, and the presence of IgM observed in rodents are related to signs of dementia in humans. The magnitude of the changes was large and consistent among the studies. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with the NRC that this is a correct summary of the hazard.
Correct.
Now, did you see him dispute any of those findings? And in this case, there was an agreement that if you ingest too much fluoride, it can damage the brain. Okay? That was accepted. It was ultimately undisputed in this case. Now, we don't study rats in the laboratory because we want to understand how rats out in the alley may be impacted by environmental fluoride chemicals. We study rats in the laboratory to understand how we humans may be potentially affected, right? And one of the scientists I deposed in this case was Dr. Christina Thayer. She's the director of EPA's Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division. She's also done research on fluoride and the brain, including while she was working at the National Toxicology Program. And she confirmed that, and she agrees, that the animal data on fluoride neurotoxicity supports the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in human beings. So like I said, at the end of the day, there was no dispute in this case that too much fluoride can damage the brain. So one of the questions I was interested in is, what is the safe dose for fluoride? What is that upper tolerable dose that we humans can ingest without concern that it could affect our brain? You know, when does that dose go from safe to toxic? Okay? So let me show you what I did, okay, and who I asked, and let's see what they said. I started with the companies that sell the chemicals that we add to water in the US, the fluoridation chemicals. These are the three largest, at the time of our lawsuit, the three largest companies that sell these chemicals, including hydrofluorosilicic acid. Okay? And I asked them all, do you know what the safe dose of fluoride is for the brain? And they all said the same thing. No, we do not. Solvay said Solvay has not taken any actions to determine the daily dose of fluoride ion that will not cause neurotoxic effects, and the other two companies did as well. So I crossed the companies off the list of people who could tell me what the safe dose is. But I didn't stop there. I went to the Food and Drug Administration, which is the US government agency that approves and regulates the drugs that we use. Okay? And they said, actually, we've not conducted or sponsored research on the risk of neurotoxicity associated with fluoride. And look at the last sentence. The FDA has no position on this topic. So I said, OK, looks like I can cross the FDA off the list of organizations and institutions that could tell me what the safe dose of fluoride is for the brain. But I didn't stop there. Let's see who we went to next. This is the representative of NSF International. This is an organization that certifies the chemicals that we add to drinking water in the US. Many states in the US have laws that say before you can add a chemical to your drinking water, you need to have it certified by the NSF International. So, does this certifying body have any data on the safe dose of fluoride? Let's see what she says. Has NSF taken any steps to determine the potential for fluoridation chemicals to cause neurotoxic effects?
No.
Does NSF have any position on whether fluoridation chemicals can cause neurotoxic effects?
Since we have not conducted our own risk assessment on the fluoridation chemicals, we do not have a position on whether they are able to cause neurotoxic effects.
Okay. What she said is, we haven't done anything to determine the answer to that question, so we do not have a position on that question. So I went ahead and crossed the NSF off the list of people who could answer this question about what the safe dose is. But I didn't stop there. I went next. Remember this guy? He is the director of CDC's Division of Oral Health. Now, to be fair, I didn't want to play a game of gotcha. Okay? I told him 30 days in advance of this deposition exactly what I was going to ask him. I said, I want this information, and I want CDC's position on it. So he had 30 days to prepare. Imagine having a test in school where you had 30 days to prepare to answer the questions, right? So let's see what the CDC says. So based on CDC's response to topic 10 and 11, it's correct to say that CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects for infants.
Yes.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes toddlers. Mm-hmm. So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on toddlers.
That's true.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes children?
Yes.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children.
Right. As stated in our response to the issue on 10 and 11, we don't conduct research ourselves related to tolerable upper fluoride intake. Again, that's under the jurisdiction of EPA's drinking water, and they set maximum and minimum containment levels about notifying people when levels are exceeded.
Okay. And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
As a rep of CDC, to my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that.
Okay. To my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that. So I crossed the CDC off the list of organizations and institutions that could answer that question for me. But did you hear the little clue he just gave us there? Did you hear the lead that he just gave us? I did. Because what he said is, well, we don't have that information, but I'm pretty sure who does. The EPA's just got to have that information, right? I was like, great. You know why? Because the EPA's the defendant in the case. So I had lots of opportunity to get information from the EPA. So why don't we go and look at the EPA? So one of the things that you can do in litigation, which I love, this is part of discovery, is you can file or serve written requests for admissions and information, okay? And I asked EPA, hey, what's the safe dose? What's that upper tolerable dose that we humans can consume without being concerned that this stuff could affect our brain? And they answered, EPA has not undertaken a systematic analysis to determine whether such a tolerable upper fluoride intake for infants is identifiable. And they repeated the same thing for the other children age groups, okay? So they don't know that information either. But I also asked EPA more questions to sort of flesh out their understanding of the safety data. Now, if you've been involved with water fluoridation debates, you may have heard some dentists say something like this. There are thousands of studies that prove water fluoridation is safe, completely harmless. And there are some of the maybe more enthusiastic proponents of fluoridation who say there's over 30,000 studies that show that water fluoridation is safe. Well, I was a little bit more modest. I just asked EPA to identify any studies that show that water fluoridation or support the safety of water fluoridation for the brain, okay? And I started with, can you show me any studies, primary studies? Now, primary studies is important. Why do I say primary studies? Because I don't want a review. I don't want some review from some Irish government who then reviews what the Canadian government said. I just want studies, okay? Actual data, okay? So I start by saying, hey, can you identify any studies that support the neurological safety of prenatal fluoride exposure, okay? Because as we'll discuss, there's a lot of concern about the impact of prenatal fluoride exposure on the brain, okay? EPA responds, and they say, hey, we got a study. We got a study. Folks, we got a hit. We got a hit, okay? I'm like, oh, what study are they citing here? Let me look. The Mullenix study. The Mullenix study, neurotoxicity of sodium fluoride in rats, 1995? I know that study very well. And I know very well that that does not support the safety of prenatal fluoride exposure. To the contrary, as EPA's own experts were forced to admit, the Mullenix study found neurotoxic effects from prenatal fluoride exposure, correct? Yes. So the one study that they cite to me to support the neurological safety of prenatal fluoride exposure, their own experts admitted does not do so. So we can put that up to a big goose egg in terms of primary studies that the EPA is aware of that support the neurological safety of prenatal fluoride exposure. I asked other questions along the similar lines. For example, I said, can you identify for me any studies that support the neurological safety of pregnant women who have more than 1 part per million fluoride in their urine, which many women do, fluoridated areas? And they said, no, we do not have any such studies. Okay? So now, the next question, okay? Next question I asked is, well, what is EPA's safe dose for fluoride based on? It's clearly not effects on the brain, right? Now, put your seatbelts on, buckle up, because what you're going to hear now may surprise you, okay? So, this condition here is called crippling skeletal fluorosis. It is a severe bone disease caused by too much ingestion of fluoride. Okay? Here's a summary of what it does to the body. It causes crippling deformities of the spine and major joints, muscle wasting, neurologic defects, and compression of the spinal cord. This is a very serious condition. If you have crippling sclerosis, you're in deep trouble. Okay, it's a systemic, overt poisoning of the body. Now, when EPA set the safe drinking water level for fluoride in the 1980s, which is still in effect in the United States today, it set the standard based on the premise that crippling skeletal fluorosis is the critical effect of fluoride exposure. That's a wonky term. Here, I'm going to talk with the EPA representative, Dr. Edward Ohanian, to flesh out what this term means, critical effect. And critical adverse effect means the effect of a substance that occurs at the lowest dose, right?
Correct.
Okay. So according to EPA, the first adverse effect that can occur to the human organism from fluoride exposure is crippling skeletal fluorosis.
Correct.
Okay. The first adverse effect that fluoride can produce to the human organism, and by the way, we're human organisms, is crippling skeletal fluorosis. That was the premise of EPA safety standard, which means if until you are crippled, you have not been harmed by fluoride, according to EPA's safety standard. Now let's break that down, okay? Let's break that down, okay? So, skeletal fluorosis is a disease that comes in various stages of severity, crippling being the stage 3 final most severe. Let's look at the pre-crippling phases of skeletal fluorosis. So here is testimony from Dr. Ohanian, the same EPA rep that we were just looking at. And the MCLG is a wonky way of saying safety standard. It means maximum contaminant level goal. It was set at 4 parts per million by the EPA. So EPA safety standard was designed to prevent the phase 3 crippling skeletal fluorosis, right? Correct. But not to prevent clinical phase 2, right? Correct. So let's look at clinical phase 2 skeletal fluorosis. Here again is the EPA representative. EPA has defined stage 2 skeletal fluorosis as characterized by sporadic pain, stiffness of the joints, and osteosclerosis of the pelvis and spine, calcification of the ligaments, and at times osteoporosis of the long bones, correct?
Correct.
And as we discussed earlier, EPA did not consider stage 2 skeletal fluorosis to be an adverse health effect when it established the MCLG in 1985, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So I'm not sure if you heard that, but we're talking calcification of the ligaments, joint pain, joint stiffness, osteosclerosis, which is like a hardening of the bone in some areas, can be brittle bone, and osteoporosis of the long bones in some patients. EPA did not consider that to be an adverse effect on human health. They saw no need to protect the public from that condition. Do you guys, I mean, I know maybe we're not all scientists in here, but does that kind of sound like an adverse effect? So this is another condition caused by excess fluoride exposure. This is the most severe form of a condition called dental fluorosis. This is severe dental fluorosis, okay? And there's no dispute, EPA understood that fluoride causes this, and EPA understood that many children at the so-called safe level of 4 parts per million would develop this condition, okay? Now, dental fluorosis is a mineralization defect of the tooth enamel, okay? And in its severe forms, like we see here, it causes excess porosity of the enamel, sort of like osteoporosis of the teeth, okay? And because of this porosity, the enamel is prone to chip and crumble and flake away, okay? And the teeth develop disfiguring brown and black staining. And as EPA knew, children with this condition can suffer psychological effects based on the acute embarrassment of showing other people their teeth. But the EPA assured us this is not an adverse health effect. This is not an adverse effect. The teeth crumbling, not an adverse effect. The disfiguring staining, not an adverse effect. So EPA did not protect against this condition. This is Paul Price. Paul Price is the scientist at the EPA who wrote the safety standard. I deposed him in this case, but I should provide to you one caveat that he gave me. He said, well, I didn't write the standard, I was the typist. I felt I should convey to you that qualification. So he's the typist. Now, at around the same time that he and the EPA released the safety standard, Paul Price wrote a press release, a mock press release that didn't go to the public. Okay? It went to other colleagues at the EPA. And in this press release, he completely eviscerates the safety standard that he just typed. And he said that under EPA's safety standard, up to 40% of children will have teeth gross enough to gag a maggot. Okay? And here in this clip, I asked him about something else he said in this press release. Going back to the press release or the mock press release that you wrote, the last sentence of it reads, EPA selected this level based upon a cost-effectiveness study which showed that it is cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride. That's what you wrote, right?
That's correct.
And what did you mean by it's cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride?
I meant to be funny.
Now, to be fair to Dr. Price, at his deposition, he said, this was dark gallows humor. And I understand that he was being asked to write essentially an indefensible standard. And he was sort of letting off steam, right? And making some jokes about the absurdity of it. But at the same time, if you're a child who's been impacted by the safety standard, it probably wouldn't be as funny. So at that time, in the 1980s, there was a union of scientists at the EPA that's there to protect the scientists from undue pressure from the administration and other things like that. And they became very concerned about the safety standard. They were frankly outraged by it. And they tried to convey their concerns to the administration, to their bosses, but they were being ignored. They were banging their heads against the wall. And it got to the point where they tried to join a lawsuit filed against their bosses by an environmental organization called the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. It's the first time that EPA scientists have ever tried to join a suit against their own bosses. And it's never happened before, never happened since. Unfortunately, the court did not allow them to participate in this court case. But it shows you the extent of their concerns about EPA's safety standard. And this is Robert Carton, Dr. Robert Carton, who was the president of the EPA union. Here I just ask him a little bit about that lawsuit. You want to support the NRDC in its challenge of the EPA's regulation.
Right.
Farm leading.
Which we didn't want to do. We made many attempts, as before we've shown here, of trying to get the attention of the powers that be and work it out. And they had no interest in it. So that it forced us into finding another avenue, because this is serious business. We're talking about harming the health of lots and lots of people, and making false statements about what actually is a health effect and what isn't a health effect.
We've been talking about things going on in the 1980s. You're probably wondering, well, what's happened since then? Okay? Okay, let's talk about what's happened since then. 2006, the National Research Council, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, a very august, authoritative body, conducted a 3-year review of the scientific literature on fluoride. And based on its review, it concluded that this safety standard is not safe. It's too high. It needs to be lowered. NRC concluded that severe dental fluorosis, that disfiguring condition of the teeth, is an adverse health effect. It needs to be protected against. The NRC also concluded that you can't just protect against crippling skeletal fluorosis. You have to protect against some of the earlier effects on the bone. I have a feeling you might be thinking, you don't really need to be a rocket scientist to know that. But NRC did due diligence and came to that conclusion. The NRC also identified a number of studies on fluoride and the brain, and fluoride and the endocrine system, including effects on the thyroid gland and the pineal gland. NRC concluded that fluoride is an endocrine disrupting chemical. Okay? Now, the NRC called on EPA to do a new risk assessment, to consider this new information. So do you want to see what EPA did? Yes. 2010, EPA releases the new risk assessment on fluoride. And here's what they concluded. Yep, we were wrong. Severe dental fluorosis is an adverse effect. So we're going to protect against it now. Okay? And they created a dose, a reference dose, safe dose, reference dose, kind of the same thing. They created a safe dose to protect against severe dental fluorosis. And that is, it's going to be a little bit wonky, 0.08 milligrams per kilogram per day. They say, if you don't get severe dental fluorosis, you're good. You're good to go. You're all good, because it's the most sensitive effect of fluoride exposure is the crumbling of the tooth enamel and the disfiguring staining of the teeth. Okay? Does that sound kind of reminiscent of what they did in the 1980s with the crippling skeletal fluorosis? As long as you don't have crippling fluorosis, you're good. Well, now we're at, as long as you don't have severe dental fluorosis, you're good. So we're making progress, maybe a little slower than we would like, okay? But we get to this court case. Now, EPA said in this document that protecting against severe dental fluorosis is going to protect you against all the other effects. So what did EPA say about this reference dose in our court case? Let's see. They say, in determining whether adding fluoridation chemicals to drinking water presents an unreasonable risk of neurotoxic effects on the brain, EPA would not rely on the 2010 reference dose. So what they're saying is, our reference dose on severe dental fluorosis is not really relevant or helpful to understanding what levels of fluoride cause effects on the brain. Do you think that would have been helpful for them maybe to disclose to the public back in 2010? That's why we have litigation and cross-examination, because EPA was forced to admit that. Okay? Now, it gets even more interesting. This is where it gets good. Okay? So EPA said in that risk assessment, 2010, it said, this is going to sound wonky, I'm going to break it down. Okay? It says the standard toxicity database, meaning all the scientific literature that's been done on fluoride and human health, for fluoride is complete, negating the need for a database uncertainty factor. Now you're thinking, what the heck is a database uncertainty factor, right? Well, a database uncertainty factor is something where, say you're setting the safety standard for dental fluorosis, okay? But you have reason to believe or suspicion or concern that fluoride might be affecting something else in the body. But you don't yet have definitive proof, and you don't have great dose response data, but you're a little concerned. Say you're concerned that fluoride might be damaging the brain. Then what you can do is you can lower that safe dose, you can lower that reference dose to protect against the potential for fluoride causing the effect on the other organ system, okay? But EPA says here, oh, don't worry about that because the database is complete. We know everything we need to know. There's no need for another database uncertainty factor. Well, guess what? I deposed, remember that Dr. Edward Ohanian from the EPA that we looked at earlier? I'm doing a deposition of him, and he volunteers. I didn't even ask him this. He volunteered it. He said, well, you know, we couldn't add an uncertainty factor because if we did, it would bring the safe dose below the optimal dose for caries prevention. Meaning, if you have a safe dose following our risk assessment guidelines, the dose is going to be so low that you can't supplement kids' diet with fluoride to help their teeth. EPA never once disclosed that rationale in this report. Never once. They never said to the public, oh, by the way, we understand there's concerns on the brain. We understand there's concerns on the endocrine system. We understand there's concerns about bone fracture, right? But we're not going to implement a safe dose to protect against those effects because if we did, we wouldn't be able to give kids enough fluoride for cavity prevention. Should they have told us that? Should they have told the public that? Yes. But they didn't. They kept that part hidden. And in my deposition, he admits it. Here's a couple clips. I said, and this is after he mentioned it to me several times, I said, sir, you made it clear that EPA can't apply uncertainty factors because they will put the reference dose below the so-called optimal dose for fluoride ingestion, right? Answer, correct. The optimal dose for fluoride ingestion for cavity prevention is 0.05 milligrams per kilogram per day, which is very close to the reference dose, which is 0.08, right? So if you implement any kind of safety factor, you're below the optimal dose. So guess what else he admitted? Guess what Dr. Ohanian admitted? He admitted that based on the data on neurotoxicity available as of 2006 from the National Research Council report, there was already enough information to support having a safety factor for fluoride's effects on the brain to lower the safe dose to protect against the brain effects, okay? I said, if you didn't have the caries prevention goal, you would apply some database uncertainty factor to account for that potential developmental neurotoxicity, correct? Yes. They never disclosed that. So, now that the EPA is saying we can't really have a safe dose, because if we did, it would be below the level that we need the kiddies to ingest for cavity prevention, I was interested to learn more about what this optimal dose is and is it really, in fact, effective at preventing cavities, okay? So let's take a look about what we learned on this point. This is a textbook, one of the leading textbooks on dental cavities or caries. Caries and cavities is the same thing, okay? And it focuses on fluoride and its impact on the teeth. And one of the editors is Dr. Ole Feierskov from Denmark. He's one of the leading what's called cariologists on fluoride in teeth. Okay? I've read Dr. Feierskov's work for years. I've always wanted to meet him because I got the sense from his writings that he may have some concerns about water fluoridation. And I was fortunate enough to go to Denmark and to meet with Dr. Feierskov. And thankfully, he agreed to write for us an expert report summarizing current scientific knowledge about fluoride in the teeth. Okay? Here's some of what he wrote. And his report was titled Rational Use of Fluorides in Modern Society. He wrote, the only proven effect of ingesting fluoride during the long-lasting process of tooth development is to develop dental fluorosis, which is the early signs of a toxic biologic effect of fluoride. Dr. Feierskoff said, listen, there's no benefit from swallowing fluoride on the teeth. Now, to be clear, Dr. Feierskoff does think there's a benefit from fluoride for oral health, but that the benefit comes from topical contact with the teeth, not from ingestion. Now, we started water fluoridation some 80 years ago on the belief that you needed to swallow fluoride. So this revelation that came about in like the 70s and 80s from Dr. Feierskoff and colleagues, that it's actually a topical effect, was a really significant one in this whole debate on fluoride. Dr. Feierskoff went so far as to say, in my professional opinion, the addition of fluoride to public water supplies is no longer justified from an oral health perspective. Okay? So I was thrilled to be able that Dr. Feierskoff was willing to speak out and work with us on this case. So what else did I do to look at this issue of fluoride ingestion and tooth decay? I served a subpoena on a professor in the United States named Stephen Levy. Who's Stephen Levy? Stephen Levy has been receiving millions of dollars from the US government since the 1990s to study the relationship between fluoride ingestion and tooth decay, as well as dental fluorosis, okay? So what he did, he assembled like a group of like 500 kids, and then every few months, him and his team like meet with the family and say, how much fluoride is a child using? Basically, how much water have they consumed? How much toothpaste are they using? Things like that. So I was always curious. Dr. Levy has been receiving millions of dollars to understand the relationship between fluoride ingestion and tooth decay, but he hasn't really published a whole lot on it. He's published a lot of papers, but his discussion of the tooth decay piece has been notably minimal, but enough to indicate that he's not finding a big effect. So I wanted to learn more. So I asked for all of the tooth ingestion data, and I got it, okay? And I got the cavity data. And I'm going to show you in graphical form what it shows, okay? Now, if ingesting fluoride was beneficial for your permanent teeth, you should see that as the fluoride ingestion goes up, tooth decay goes down. This line here, this line is the best fit, okay? It's the best fit for how the data works. And it shows that there is no relationship between fluoride ingestion for the first 6 years of life and tooth decay at age 13. And by the way, this wasn't done by me. I went to a biostatistician at University of California, Los Angeles, who put this together. And I gave the data. Check this out. I gave EPA this data. I go, here's the ingestion data from Dr. Levy. Here's the tooth decay data from Dr. Levy if you want to challenge this. They never challenged any of this. They never disputed that this is accurate. So let's go back to the CDC. I mean, after all, the CDC, they're the Division of Oral Health. They're the teeth experts, right? So let's look at what they said about fluoride ingestion and tooth decay, okay? Admission number 1. So CDC recognizes and accepts that fluoride's predominant mechanism for preventing tooth decay comes from fluoride's topical contact with the outside of the enamel, correct?
Predominantly, that's where the benefits are, yes.
Okay. So EPA is conceding the predominant benefit of fluoride on teeth for reducing tooth decay comes from topical contact, not from ingestion. Again, that's contrary to what we believed when we started fluoridation back in the 40s and 50s. And here is what else he said. And then Featherstone writes, there is now overwhelming evidence that the primary caries preventive mechanisms of action of fluoride are post-eruptive through topical effects for both children and adults. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And the CDC agrees with that statement, correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So the CDC agrees. There is now, quote, overwhelming evidence that fluoride's predominant effect is topical and post-eruptive, which is a wonky way of saying after the teeth have erupted, okay? So the CDC is agreeing with Dr. Feierskoff that the predominant effect is topical. Now, Dr. Feierskoff goes further than that, says there's absolutely no benefit from the ingestion. But, you know, the CDC and Dr. Feierskoff are not that far apart here, okay? So let's look at the CDC's second admission on this, which I think is very important. Now, in this case, there was a lot of discussion about the vulnerability of the developing brain to fluoride exposure, okay? And particularly during the in utero period when the baby's in the womb, as well as during the early months of infancy. And there is, as you can see here, this is Dr. Christina Thayer from the EPA. I asked her, Dr. Thayer, is the developing brain more vulnerable than the adult brain? Yes. And is the brain more vulnerable to toxic agents during the in utero period than during adulthood? Yes. There's no dispute about that in this case. And the EPA also admitted, this was an undisputed fact, that fluoride passes through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. So the fluoride that a mom is ingesting during pregnancy is going to have access to the baby and can get into the baby's brain, okay? Given that this is a period of heightened concern for fluoride in the brain, I wanted to ask CDC, do you have any evidence to indicate that this is beneficial, that the mom's exposure to fluoridated water is beneficial for the baby during pregnancy, okay? So let's see what CDC said. The CDC's conclusion in 2001 is that they had good evidence, high quality evidence to show that fluoride supplements do not provide a benefit for children when given during pregnancy, correct?
Yeah, when given to pregnant women.
Okay. So by 2001, CDC had good, high quality evidence to show that fluoride supplementation during pregnancy does not help the baby's teeth. Based on that, I asked, so if a mom from the public emailed CDC and said, so is fluoridated water going to do any good for my baby if I'm drinking it during pregnancy? What would the CDC say? Here's his answer. So if a pregnant mother wrote an email to CDC asking, if I drink fluoridated water during my pregnancy, will that provide a benefit to the teeth of my baby? CDC would not answer yes to that question, correct?
If we were to get an email as such, we would summarize our understanding of the evidence in saying we have not found evidence that supports that shows benefit to the child if ingested, if community water fluoridation or some other form of fluoride is ingested by the mother.
Translated, there's no benefit from prenatal fluoride exposure. No benefit that could offset the risk to the brain during that period of life. So let's go to the next admission by the CDC. I asked about the potential benefits. Does CDC have any knowledge of benefits during the early months of life? And the reason I asked that, as we've touched upon a little bit already, is that as with the prenatal period, there's a heightened vulnerability during the early months of life to the impacts of toxic substances on the brain. Here is a statement from the EPA in this case. The neonatal stage is a period of rapid development of the nervous system and is considered a critical window of development, okay? And the EPA also agreed that the developing brain is distinguished by the absence of a blood-brain barrier. The development of this barrier is a gradual process beginning in utero and complete at approximately 6 months of age. So what does that mean? That means that the baby for the first 6 months of life does not have a fully formed blood-brain barrier. So if the baby is exposed to a toxic substance, that toxic substance is going to have access to the brain, okay? So here's why we need to be concerned about bottle feeding babies with fluoridated water, because this is a population that is at significantly heightened risk from water fluoridation. Okay? A breastfed baby receives the lowest fluoride exposure of all age groups in the population. Okay? And that's because breast milk contains very low levels of fluoride, which I think is instructive. Because breast milk is typically where you find the elements, the nutrients and vitamins that are essential to healthy growth and development, right? So the fact that fluoride is not in breast milk gives us some indications that young children should not be ingesting fluoride, right? Well, if you, instead of breastfeeding the baby, give the baby infant formula made with fluoridated water, you flip the situation on its head. You go from the situation where the baby is the lowest exposed age group in the population to the highest exposed, by far. Like a bottle-fed baby is receiving far more fluoride than anyone in this room. Unless you have some really major, like, other source of exposure beyond water, okay? So at a moment of heightened vulnerability, what EPA referred to as a critical window of development, we are exposing babies to very high levels of fluoride, okay? So there's a concern there. So I asked the CDC, do they have any evidence to indicate that this is beneficial? Let's see what he says. Is the CDC aware of any evidence demonstrating benefits from consumption of fluoridated drinking water during the first 6 months of life?
We are not aware of any evidence.
Okay. That is a statement made after 75 years of water fluoridation. Just think about the millions upon millions upon millions of kids that were bottle fed with fluoridated water and know that there was never a benefit to justify that risk. And there still is not a benefit to justify that risk. So when you're thinking about water fluoridation, I really encourage you to think about this age group of the population and ask yourself, should the public water supply be safe for newborn infants? So let's go to the next chapter of this case, which is trial. The fun stuff. Trial started in June of 2020 during the height of the COVID situation. I want to talk with you a little bit about the experts that we presented to the court, as well as EPA's experts. Here's Dr. Howard Hu. He is a scientist who has studied the impact of chemicals on human health for decades, very well regarded and respected scientist. He is the principal investigator of what's called a birth cohort study in Mexico City, where he's studying a group of pregnant moms and their children. And these moms have been exposed to fluoridated salt. Now, fluoridated salt is basically, it's another way of delivering the so-called optimal dose of fluoride for cavity prevention. It gives you the same basic dose as water fluoridation, okay? Now, what Dr. Hu has been doing is he studies the level of fluoride in the urine of the mom during the pregnancy. And then when the child is born and turns at age 4, age 6, and age 12, Dr. Hu and his team measure the IQ of the child, okay? And what he has found is that as the fluoride level in the mom goes up, as there's more systemic fluoride exposure, the IQ of the child goes down. Significant adverse impacts on the IQ of the children at age 4, at age 6, and at age 12. It remains, okay? So we called Dr. Hu to stand. And by the way, Dr. Hu's study was funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, okay? We also called Dr. Bruce Lanphier. As with Dr. Hu, I was thrilled and honored, truly honored to be able to call both Dr. Hu and Lanphier to the stand. Dr. Lanphier is the scientist who conducted the seminal studies on how lead impacts IQ. He found that low levels of lead that were previously considered safe can actually affect IQ. And Dr. Lanfear's research has been used by governments around the world, including the EPA, to set safety standards to protect us from lead. Now, Dr. Lanfear is now studying fluoride and IQ. And he's conducting a birth cohort study in Canada where the moms are exposed to fluoridated water, not the fluoridated salt. In fact, and the average level of the fluoride in the water is 0.6, which is a little bit less than Wellington, which is about 0.8, okay? And Dr. Lanfear has studied the kids, the IQ of the kids at age 4. He hasn't gotten to 6 and 12 yet. But at age 4, he found that as the fluoride level in the mom went up, IQ went down significantly in boys. Okay? He didn't find the effect in girls for the urine levels, but he did find it with boys. And boys, by the way, are known to have heightened or elevated levels of neurodevelopmental disorders. So for some reason, boys are being impacted by the environment when it comes to their brain development more than girls. Okay? And in Dr. Lanfear's study, he found the effect in the boys, but not the girls. Okay? Now, at trial, EPA agreed that Dr. Lanfear's and Dr. Hu's studies are the most methodologically reliable human studies to date on the impact of fluoride and on neurodevelopment. So for any of you in New Zealand who know about the study by Jonathan Broadbent from 2015, he's a dentist, he loves fluoride, and he found himself somehow qualified to study fluoride and IQ, and he published a study in 2015 claiming absolutely no effect of fluoridated water on IQ. Well, the EPA, in our case, recognized that Dr. Hu's and Dr. Lanfear's studies are methodologically superior to Dr. Broadbent's study. Okay? Now, in the trial, I called Dr. Joyce Donahue, who's a senior scientist at EPA's Office of Water, and she has been EPA's subject matter expert on fluoride since the 1990s. She's been working on fluoride for a long time. I happen to disagree with Dr. Donahue on a lot of things, but here is what she said when I asked her about these new birth cohort studies funded by the NIH on fluoride and IQ. You would agree that this study right here adds further reason why we need to do a reassessment of the fluoride safety standards in the United States.
I think it's a reason for doing not just the United States. I think it's a reason for doing an update to the fluoride assessment.
Everywhere.
Well, for anybody who's interested in fluoride and the need for regulation of fluoride exposure.
Right. And anyone interested in making sure that fluoride is safe for consumption.
That people are not overexposed. Yes.
Right. Okay. So what Dr. Donahue is admitting here is that, we talked about how EPA has these safety standards that are based on, really severe bone effects and teeth effects. She's agreeing that in light of these high quality studies finding effects on the brain, we need to be reassessing our safety standards on fluoride. And the judge found that testimony to be significant. We also called Dr. Grandjean, Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who's a real heavyweight in the field of environmental health. He's an expert on the impact of chemicals on the developing brain. He's written extensively on this subject. He agreed that the weight of epidemiological evidence leaves no reasonable doubt that developmental neurotoxicity is a serious human health risk associated with elevated fluoride exposure, including those occurring at the levels added to drinking water in fluoridated areas. And Dr. Grandjean provided extensive testimony at trial as to why, when we look at all of the animal data and all of the human data, there's a real reason for concern that fluoridated drinking water is harming the brain. We also called Dr. Kathleen Thiessen, who was one of the scientists who wrote the National Research Council report from 2006. And she testified about how the evidence on fluoride today is more than adequate to demonstrate an unreasonable risk under EPA's risk assessment framework. Okay? So, are you ready to see who EPA called as their experts? Let's take a look. Exponent Exponent. Okay, so like I said, I sue big corporations in the United States about dangerous products and chemicals. And one of their favorite go-to, what's called science for hire organizations, is Exponent. Okay? You know, you name it. Any pesticide manufacturer, DuPont, Monsanto, any chemical company, they're always going to Exponent. And Ellen Chang, right here, is one of their favorite go-to epidemiologists. She's published studies on Agent Orange in cancer, on glyphosate in cancer, on organophosphate pesticides and various health effects, on arsenic and neurodevelopmental problems. You name it, PFOA, perfluorinated chemicals. And every single time, there's a really interesting pattern in her work. Her conclusions always end up like this. There's not sufficient evidence to demonstrate a causal connection between the chemical and the adverse health effect. Every single time. 11 major reviews that she's done, and every single time, not sufficient evidence, not sufficient evidence, not sufficient evidence, and on and on and on. Any guesses on what she said about water fluoridation? Exactly. So EPA did not call any of its agency scientists to defend the safety of water fluoridation. Now, I don't know how much you know about the EPA, but they have a lot of scientists. But they didn't call one of them to defend the safety of fluoridation, or to review the evidence on water fluoridation. But I have to say, there is one caveat that I'm about to reveal. And that is that they did call an EPA scientist to the stand by the name of Dr. Tala Henry. Now, Dr. Tala Henry admitted that she's never worked on fluoride before. She's never reviewed the fluoride literature before. She does not consider herself an expert on fluoride and has never worked on a fluoride regulation. Also, for this case, she did not do her own review of the scientific literature. Instead, she relied on Exponent's review of the scientific literature and said, based on their review, I'm pretty confident there's no problem. Okay? So here's something that came to light at trial, and it was very gratifying for me. Because I've been saying, and for those of you who know my father, Paul Connett, who's been to New Zealand before, he's been saying for a long time, he's an environmental chemist, that EPA is using a double standard to assess the evidence on fluoride, that it's treating fluoride differently than it treats other toxic substances, that it's not using its risk assessment criteria to assess the risk posed by fluoride. Well, guess what? We demonstrated that at trial very clearly. Here, June 16th, 2020, the day before closing arguments, I had Tala Henry on the stand, okay? And I said, you held the plaintiffs to a burden of proof that EPA has not held a single chemical under Section 6, TSCA, before, correct? Answer, by the words on the page, I guess that's true. She admitted right there before the judge that they held us to a burden of proof. They've never held a single chemical before. I was happy with that admission. So we get done with trial, we have our closing arguments, and the judge begins a lengthy soliloquy, okay? And he says, the EPA appears to have applied a standard of causation, which from my read of TSCA is not accurate. It's not a proper application. It's not the proper standard. He picked up on this. He picked up on Dr. Henry's admission that they held us to a heightened burden of proof. So that's good. So far, so good. The judge also says in his closing comments, there is serious evidence here. There is no doubt that these two studies from Canada and Mexico raise serious questions. I'm like, I agree with that. I'm with you. Now, I'm thinking at this point in time, the judge is making these comments right after we finish closing arguments. And I'm thinking, we're getting pretty close here. We might win. We might win. I'm feeling like we have a verdict right in our grasp, but not so soon. Because the judge decided to put the case on hold. He said, I understand there's a government review being conducted on fluoride NIQ, the very issue that is at issue in this case. And it's being conducted by the National Toxicology Program at the US government. These subject matter experts on how chemicals affect our health. And he goes, I want to see what they have to say before I make my own determination. How do you think I felt about that? I was a little nervous, not going to lie, because I've seen how the US government has handled the fluoride issue. Like, remember the crippling skeletal fluorosis piece? Yeah. So I was nervous and concerned that now the fate of our case is tied up with whether a US government agency is going to agree that fluoride is lowering IQ or can lower IQ. But I also understood why the court did that. Because we're asking this court to do something very significant, to make an official pronouncement that water fluoridation is damaging the brains of potentially millions of people, right? And so we're asking the court to do a lot. And the court reasonably wanted to consider everything in the most up-to-date, latest science before making a decision. So what did we do? Chapter 5, the stay. Okay? So we waited for the NTP, National Toxicology Program. What did we do next? We waited. And what did we do next? Any guesses? We waited some more. Anyone ever heard of that story called Waiting for Godot? We were waiting for Godot, okay? And then, summer of 2022, 2 years after the judge put the case on hold, I was contacted by a person with knowledge who knew what was going on with the NTP review. She told me, that review that you've been waiting for, it's completed. But they have been told not to release it. And then she told me something more concerning. She goes, that review may never be released. So the very report that my case is on hold for, that we've been waiting for 2 years now, I have now been told it may never be released. So what do I do? Here's the good news. In the United States, we have a law. It's one of my favorite laws. It's a really good law. It's called the Freedom of Information Act, otherwise called FOIA. And I immediately began filing FOIA requests to the CDC, to the National Toxicology Program, to the Food and Drug Administration, to the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, and other federal agencies asking for all communications that they have related to this NTP report. And on October 30th, 2022, don't know how this happened, but there was a very kind FOIA officer at the CDC who sent me an email containing 4,000 pages of documentation. Let me show you some of what she sent. And I should say my fiance, Emily, who's here with me, as I'm getting these emails in, she's like, don't read them until I'm home. And then we'd be like, literally, I'd get a new batch, and she's like, don't read them until I'm there. So let me show you some of what we learned, okay? April 28th, 2022, Mary Wolf, Associate Director at the NTP, sends an email to Casey Hannon. Remember him, the CDC guy? Okay? She goes, attached is the pre-publication draft of the NTP monograph on the state of science on fluoride. At this time, the analysis and the conclusions are set, meaning we're done, right? We're working towards its release in mid to late May. Okay, great. Okay, now, one problem. CDC did not like this report. That same day, April 28th, Greg Holder, a policy analyst at CDC, says, don't know if it's time to call in the big guns from Office of Director, but I view this with extreme displeasure and I am sure that they will too. CDC did not like what NTP was saying, okay? Now, a couple days later, Tracy Bamer, CDC fluoridation scientist, meets with individuals from the American Dental Association and the private dental lobby and tells them CDC was in the process of proactively and preemptively taking steps to intervene, okay? But NTP keeps moving. On May 11th, 2022, Mary Wolf, NTP, sends an email announcing we have set May 18th for the publication. 7 days away, NTP is going public with the report. 7 days away. Yeah, right? We're feeling pretty good right now, right? Not so fast. The next day, Casey Hannon, the CDC director who you've been seeing today, met with the government officials from multiple agencies saying, here are my takeaways. The May 18th release date for the NTP report is almost certainly not going to happen. The Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health and NIH Office of Director are pretty clearly going to get more involved. And that's what the CDC wanted. They went up the chain, they went to the Assistant Secretary of Health, and they were pleading with the Assistant Secretary to put the kibosh on the report. Here is an email from a few days later from Gregory Holder from the CDC saying, CDC officials, Assistant Secretary for Health Rachel Levine, and others have looked at the monograph and are pushing back hard at the NTP. Okay? And that's what they were doing. They were pushing back hard at the NTP, and they succeeded. Because by June 3rd, 2022, the CDC reported, the latest we heard yesterday is that Assistant Secretary of Health Levine has put the report on hold until further notice. And that's when that person with knowledge contacted me. And as she said, the report was complete. Documents show that. They had been prevented from publishing it, and now it's in limbo, okay? Now, one of the encouraging things with these emails is that there were people at the NTP who were pushing back at the CDC and standing up for their report. And most notably was Brian Berridge, the scientific director of the NTP. And in this email, which he wrote a few minutes after hearing that they may not be able to publish their report, he says, after 17 years in industry, he used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, I've seen efforts to modify messages to fit commercial interests. I wasn't party to that there, and I'm not game to do that here. Because he said in other emails, this is a violation of scientific integrity. Let's move on. I start getting some of these emails early in the process, and I go to the court and I say, Your Honor, we got to go back to court. We got to go back to trial now. We can't keep waiting for the Godot. We can't keep waiting for this report that may never be released. And I'm very happy to say that the court agreed. He lifted the stay, and the court said, he goes, listen, I really, really wanted the final NTP report. I wanted it for my decision in this case. But I'm now prepared to move forward without it. And that brings us to Chapter 6, the second trial, which was the really fun trial, okay? This was in January and February of last year, 2024, okay? And the focus of this trial mostly was on what did the NTP find? Why was the CDC so upset? And what is the implications of NTP's findings to water fluoridation, okay? So we called, and I'm glad to say, Dr. Berridge agreed to fly to San Francisco and go into that courtroom and tell the judge about the process that led up to his decision to publish the report. And I asked Dr. Berridge, prior to the fluoride monograph, when you, the scientific director, determined that the report was final and complete, was the report always published? Answer, yes. This was the first time where he, the scientific director, determined that this report is ready to go, and that decision was taken away from him, okay? So now let's look at the NTP's findings. What did they find? First thing is they found that there is a large body of data on the relationship between fluoride and IQ in human populations. The NTP identified 72 studies of fluoride and IQ in human populations, mostly from China and areas where you have elevated fluoride in the water, more than we add to water for fluoridation, okay? And the NTP found that there is a consistent association in these studies between elevated fluoride and reduced IQ. As the NTP says here, reported associations between higher fluoride exposure and lower children's IQ are consistent in the vast majority of studies of both low and high quality. NTP also said that, in summary, the high quality studies with low potential for bias, consistently demonstrate lower IQ scores with higher fluoride exposure. Now, the NTP did make an important caveat where they said that their confidence in this consistent association is primarily based on studies that have looked at 1.5 parts per million in the water. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's NTP's conclusion. Okay? NTP also said that, methodological biases or methodological deficiencies are unlikely to explain this consistent association between fluoride and reduced IQ. A spurious association is unlikely. And importantly, the NTP said that even in fluoridated areas like Wellington, okay, because people drink very different amounts of water. Some people drink a lot of water, right? And some people also get fluoride from other sources besides the water, okay? And because of that, there are some women, pregnant women, who have more fluoride in their body, as measured by their urinary fluoride levels, than women living in areas with 1.5 ppm. So some women in fluoridated areas are exceeding the hazard level because they are drinking a lot of water or getting fluoride from other sources. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, okay, I know we're getting late here, folks. I appreciate your patience. It's a little bit hot in here. We're getting close to the end, okay? Getting close to the end. Well, I think so, Now, we're at the second trial. The evidence is coming in great. The NTP report is fantastic. And then a surprise development. And I don't want any more surprise developments in this case, okay? I've had enough. I come home from trial February 6th, and I have an email waiting for me saying there's a big new report on fluoride and IQ. It was funded by the Health Canada, this health agency in Canada, which has never been a friend to us on fluoride. And I'm thinking, oh God. Oh God, not another government report. So I begrudgingly, with great apprehension, read this report. And let's look at what they found. The overall evidence identified to date strongly suggests that fluoride can affect cognitive outcomes in children, specifically reduction in IQ scores at levels close to those currently seen in North American drinking water. I didn't see that one coming. I did not see that one coming, okay? So the next morning I go to court and I say, Your Honor, it's not my fault. It's not my fault, but there's a new study and I think we should, and the judge says, I want it. And the judge brought it into evidence. We submitted that report, and every expert that took the stand thereafter talked about this report from Risk Sciences International on behalf of Health Canada. So now, let's talk about the two key admissions that EPA made in this case, okay? The first is one we've already touched upon a little bit, which is that neurotoxicity is a hazard of fluoride exposure. Meaning if you ingest too much fluoride, it can damage the brain. Fluoride is a neurotoxicant. Okay? Let's look at some of the clips. This is one of EPA's experts, Jesus Ibar-Luzuea.
Do you agree that at least at high doses, epidemiological evidence is consistent in showing an association between fluoride and adverse neurodevelopmental effects?
Definitely.
Given the findings from the high-dose epidemiological literature, do you agree that at least at high doses, fluoride is a neurotoxicant?
I would say yes.
So he agrees fluoride is a neurotoxicant. Okay? Now, let's look to the testimony from Dr. Stanley Barone. Now, Dr. Barone is a true bona fide risk assessment scientist from the EPA, okay? And in this deposition clip, I asked Dr. Barone whether the NTP's findings on fluoride and IQ are sufficient to meet EPA's definition of neurotoxicity. Basically, EPA has these, quote, guidelines for neurotoxicity risk assessment, where they have certain criteria for when a chemical is a neurotoxicant, okay? And one of those criteria is sufficient human evidence. I wanted to find out whether we now have sufficient human evidence that fluoride's a neurotoxicant. Let's see what he says. And by the way, he wasn't an easy witness. As you will see, he fought me a lot, but let's see what he says. You would certainly agree that based on NTP's assessment of the literature as of April 2021, that there was sufficient human evidence of a neurotoxicity hazard as defined under the EPA guidelines. Objection.
Again, associating fluoride exposure from multiple routes and multiple sources, there's an association. But again, relating that back to drinking water alone, most of the studies are looking at total fluoride. They're not looking specifically at fluoride from drinking water.
Okay, but in terms of total fluoride exposure, you would agree that the literature that NTP reviewed up through April 2021 meets EPA's sufficient human evidence standard under the guidelines.
For hazard ID.
Okay. You agree with that?
I would agree that there's significant evidence there for a sufficiency call.
Right. And you agree that it meets the sufficient human evidence standard?
It meets the sufficient evidence standard.
Finally. You know, I appreciated his descriptor that it's a significant evidence. Okay, I like that, Dr. Brown, appreciate that very much. But is it sufficient human evidence? And he gave it to us. So that was an important admission in the case. And by the way, Dr. Barone also testified that the NTP systematic review, the NTP report, is a high quality review. So if you hear people, perhaps from your Ministry of Health, tell you that this is not a high quality report or doesn't need to be given much weight, just keep in mind that the EPA in this case had every reason to argue that it's not a high quality report and shouldn't be given much weight, but the EPA did not make that argument. Okay? So let's go to the second major admission in this case, which is something that the EPA has never really agreed to before, and that is that a margin of safety is needed to protect people from fluoride. Okay? Now, let me show you the testimony here from Dr. Barone on this point. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what a margin of safety is, okay? But before I do, just know that the EPA uses some pretty wonky language. So they don't use margin of safety, they use benchmark MOE, or benchmark margin of exposure. And so I had to often interpret these terms for the court. But I'm going to ask Dr. Barone here about a benchmark MOE, okay? Which is margin of safety. Let's see what he says. Did you give any consideration as to what an appropriate benchmark MOE should be for fluoride neurotoxicity?
Yeah, I did. Given that the critical studies in question are probably epidemiological studies, human studies, uncertainty factor of 10, which is appropriate for all life stages, inclusive of all life stages and vulnerabilities at face value, would be the benchmark MOE.
So he just testified that you need a margin of safety of 10 for fluoride. So what does that mean? So what does that mean? What is the implications of that? Why is that important? Okay. Well, let's go back to the NTP report. Remember how the NTP said the hazard level is about 1.5 ppm? That's where they see the consistent association between fluoride and reduced IQ. Okay, now people like in the Ministry of Health will say, that's completely irrelevant. 1.5? You're adding fluoride to water in Wellington at 0.8. What's the big deal? Like, who cares, right? It's irrelevant, right? They make that statement because they completely ignore this concept of a margin of safety, okay? Because if you take a margin of safety of 10 and apply that to a 1.5 ppm hazard level, your safe level is 0.15, okay? 0.15 is a lot lower than what you add to water here in Wellington and to most areas of New Zealand, okay? So why do you need a margin of safety? Why do you need it? Why is this such an important concept that we should all be mindful of when we're talking about fluoride in human health? Here's why. One dose does not fit all with fluoride or with any other toxic substance. We've learned from decades of research on many different toxic chemicals that people respond very differently to the same dose of a toxic substance. Some people, thankfully, are very resistant. They don't suffer effects even at high levels of exposure. But some people are very vulnerable and can suffer effects at even low levels of exposure. With fluoride, we know that people with nutrient deficiencies or suboptimal nutrient intake, like deficiencies of calcium or iodine, are more vulnerable to the impacts of fluoride. We also know that people with kidney disease, declining kidney function, are more vulnerable to fluoride because they have a harder time excreting this from their body. They build more of it up, okay? We also know that genetics plays a really important role in how people respond to fluoride, okay? But here's what we don't know. We don't know who in this room has that genetic polymorphism that's going to make them more vulnerable. Do you have it? 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 No one knows. And you know who else doesn't know? The government. Okay? We just know that there's a broad variability in how people respond to fluoride. And given that, we need to have a margin of safety to protect those who are more vulnerable, right? And so Dr. Barone, EPA's risk assessment scientist, agreed that you need a margin of safety of 10. So what was the big dispute? And I'm going to have to, I know I'm going too late, but we're going to go quickly, and we're going to be done, I think, in 5 minutes. Okay? Don't quote me. So what was the key dispute? Okay, what was the key dispute? The key dispute kind of goes back to the question that I was pestering all those people with at the beginning. What is that dose that goes from safe to toxic? What is the dose that you begin to experience the brain effects, okay? Or a population does, okay? When does it go from safe to toxic? And how does it vary based on individual susceptibility? Well, let's look at some of the data in this case. Our expert, Dr. Grandjean, did a benchmark dose analysis where he concluded that at just 0.3 parts per million fluoride in the mom's urine during pregnancy is associated with IQ loss. That's a level that he estimates is associated with a 1-point drop in IQ. Now keep in mind that most pregnant women in a fluoridated area, like here in Wellington, will have urinary fluoride levels about 0.7, 0.8 on average. But there's about 5 to 10% of women who are going to have about 2 parts per million and more, okay? For those women, you're looking at a risk in the ballpark of 6 to 7 IQ points from fluoride exposure, okay? So that was Dr. Grandjean's estimated hazard level. Now, as we talked about, the National Toxicology Program, which did a different analysis, estimated a 1.5 ppm. That's where you have some confidence in the hazard. And then let's look at what Dr. Barone said. As it stands now, would you dispute that fluoride at concentrations above 2 parts per million is associated with neurotoxic effects?
I think there's something going on. I'm not sure exactly at what level.
And there's something, you would agree that above 2 parts per million, something's going on?
Objection.
The systematic review that NTP did, and I think the Vernier also is sort of pointing in that direction.
Okay. Something is going on above 2 parts per million, so says EPA's main expert in the case, Dr. Barone. That means something's happening to the brain. He is prepared to admit that above 2 parts per million. Now do a margin of safety of 10 to a 2 ppm hazard level, and you're down to 0.2, okay? So, trial's finished. Judge sends us an email. And the judge wants to know, he really is pushing us, what's the hazard level? Tell me what you're prepared to agree to, okay? And he goes to the EPA and says, hey, EPA, your own expert, Dr. Barone, says something's going on above 2 parts per million. You're going to agree to a hazard level around 2 parts per million? You want to see what their attorney said? They go, Your Honor, yeah, Dr. Barone said something's going on above 2 parts per million, but that could be anywhere from 2 parts per million to infinity. Equipoise between 2 parts per million and infinity. I don't think the court found that to be a very credible statement. But the trial ends. And then we did something which we've done before. We waited. And any guesses on what we did next? And then on September 24th, 2024, I get an email containing the judge's findings of fact and conclusions of law, an 80-page document that analyzes the evidence that we had submitted over 7 years. And the judge states, quote, "The court finds that fluoridation of water at 0.7 milligrams per liter, the level presently considered optimal in the United States, poses an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children." We won the case. And the judge states, in all, there is substantial and scientifically credible evidence establishing that fluoride poses a risk to human health. It is associated with a reduction in the IQ of children and is hazardous at dosages that are far too close to fluoride levels in the drinking water of the United States. And based on this finding, the court has ordered the EPA to take regulatory action to eliminate this neurological risk posed by water fluoridation. So the times of bureaucratic lethargy are over. The EPA has to take action. So I know I've already blown through all of my claims of being done in 5 minutes. So here's the last few. It's chapter 7. It's the aftermath of the case. Okay, and about a month after the decision, Robert Kennedy posts on Twitter. He posts on Twitter that if he is fortunate enough to be part of the new administration, he will take action, meaningful action, to address the risks posed by fluoride in drinking water. I was privileged and happy to say that he did cite my interview here in this tweet. After Robert Kennedy's tweet, a few weeks after, the Surgeon General of the state of Florida, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, issued recommendations for Florida communities where he called on them to end their water fluoridation programs. Dr. Ladapo called water fluoridation public health malpractice. And based on Dr. Ladapo's recommendations, we've seen many counties and communities in Florida vote to end their fluoridation program. We're now at about 35 communities that have ended their water fluoridation programs after the court's ruling last fall. And there's dozens of communities right now currently considering doing that as well. I've never seen any momentum like this ever in my time working on fluoride, which is far too long, by the way. And so it's been encouraging to see. And the next chapter in all of this is yours to write, okay? And I just offer a few closing remarks on the situation as I understand here in New Zealand. I've had the opportunity over the past week to meet with councils throughout the Northland, or 3 or 4 councils, and had really good conversations, including with councilors up in Whangarei. And these councils are all very concerned that they are being forced against their will to fluoridate their drinking water. And to give you an example, in Whangarei, the council is very much does not want to fluoridate their water because they're concerned about their own health. They're concerned about the health of their community. The Ministry of Health has told them, if you do not have fluoride in your water by March 28th, we will fine you $200,000. And for every day thereafter, if you do not have fluoride in your water, we're going to fine you $10,000 every single day, forevermore. Now, Whangarei doesn't want to fluoridate its water. It really doesn't. But it's also concerned about taking on a massive, crippling fine if it doesn't do so. The same concern is Rotorua. I met with the counselors there. They don't want to fluoridate. But they're also concerned. There's even concern that the Ministry of Health would actually go after the counselors individually, personal liability for the community's failure to fluoridate or refusal to fluoridate water. So what I think really needs to happen right now in New Zealand is to find a way to reclaim that right to choose. That this is not a decision for the central government to make. This is a decision ultimately that every individual, every family should have the right to do. Every individual should say, because in medicine there's a long cherished right called the right of informed consent. And we all deserve that right. We all deserve the right to say, you know what, fluoride ingestion is not for me. I don't want to ingest fluoride, and I don't want it for my family either. And we shouldn't be forced by the government against our will to ingest it. But that's what's happening right now under the current situation. And I think the central government's failure to recognize that shows a lack of respect for your rights. And it also shows, it kind of highlights that water fluoridation is effectively medication by force. Because they're saying we're going to fine you into oblivion if you don't fluoridate your water, right? So, key thing is, the Ministry of Health has not had any interest in speaking with me. We've reached out to them throughout this tour. They haven't responded. So I think the Ministry of Health generally is unelected officials. I think they're harder to persuade, okay? Again, they speak through press release, not through dialogue. So I think the key thing is to find a way to get your elected officials, your MPs, to put pressure on the Ministry of Health to change course and to find a new way, a different way, a better way, a healthier way. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for your time today.
Really insightful and some fabulous information. Okay, well, come on guys. So come up. Hello, how are you? Hello, how are you?
Mr. Peters, it's a pleasure to meet you.
How are you all?
We're very good, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you and an honor. And for the past 7.5 years, I have been litigating against the U.S. government on water fluoridation. And I'm happy to say that after 7 years, the federal court agreed with us that water fluoridation, adding fluoride to drinking water, poses an unreasonable risk to human health in the form of reduced IQ for children. This was a federal court ruling in September of last year. The court has ordered our government to take action to address this risk of neurotoxicity and neurological effects from water fluoridation. So now the government has an obligation under the law to do something. Over the past week, I've had an opportunity to meet with council members throughout the North Island, and they all have been asking, and they all want to see the right to make this decision as to whether to fluoridate the water or not, to be back to a local decision. And so they really don't want to be forced against their will to continue adding fluoride to water. This is a matter of individual rights, the right to not be forced to take medication against your will. So what we're hoping is that the new government will respect each community's right and decision on this issue and not compel them to fluoridate the drinking water, especially in light of the new science that has come out as recognized by the federal court in the US, which again determined that this program poses an unreasonable risk to human health.
Well, can I just say, I'm not, and not our position in New Zealand first, to call this an Aaron Brockovich moment, but we are for, and always have been, for the choice of the local people in the referendum. And that was a right taken away from them, and we want it restored. That precisely is our position, without entering in all the arguments, for the people to decide on this issue, and we want that right to them restored. Right? Yes. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.